Okay. Okay, so good evening. My name is Kelsey Nordyke, and I'm the Kelly County Extension Agent here in Winfield. And we want to welcome you to the wheat pre-plant webinar for South Central Kansas. We have a few counties who work together throughout the year to bring you our wheat plots. And then we wanted to make sure to provide some information for you this evening as you prepare for the upcoming year. So with that, our participating counties and agents from Cowley County is myself. Harvey County is Ryan Fleming, and you're going to hear from Ryan here in just a few minutes. From Sedgwick County is Jeff Seiler, and from Sumner County is Randy Hine. And then our specialists joining us this evening are Romulo Lalato, Kelsey Anderson, and Gretchen Sassenrath. So we're excited to hear from them, and I'm going to ask Ryan to share just a little bit, and then after that we're going to turn it over to Jeff.
First of all, I'd like to thank our sponsors to help us with harvesting the plot and everything. Without them, we wouldn't be able to do this. So we really appreciate them. Prairie Land, American Ag Credit, Impact Bank, Sedgwick County Farm Bureau, and Central National Bank. Big thanks to them for donating for money for us to keep this plot going year after year. Then the next one is the info, right, or the yields.
Sorry, what was that?
Is the next slide is that the yields on it?
No, this is your slide right here.
Okay, gotcha. Yeah, so big thanks to them and really appreciate it.
All right. Hi, everyone. My name is Jeff Seiler, the Ag Agent in Sedgwick County. Our first speaker for the night is Gretchen Sassenrath. She is a professor of agronomy doing research out of our Southeast Research and Extension Center located in Parsons. Gretchen has really helped fill in since our Southeast area agronomist position has been vacant the last couple years, getting close to 2 years now, I'm thinking. She has been working on some multi-year data analysis for our South Central Kansas wheat plots. So Gretchen, if you are ready, I will let you take over.
Okay, great. Thank you very much. First of all, I'd also really like to thank Jeff and others for pulling this together. I think this is really important to do. As Jeff said, I'm the cropping systems agronomist at the Southeast Research and Extension Center in Parsons. And I've put together some multi-year. This project has been going on for quite a while. So I've just put together some comparison studies from one year to the next to look at how the varieties have performed. And this information is available on the website too. We've had this project, like I say, going on for several years now in 7 different counties all around the area. And you can see some counties have multiple sites and some have multiple years. Some years we've had a lot of trouble just getting the crop to grow. 2019 was particularly challenging with the excess rain. A lot of the plots just didn't make. This year we've had 5 sites. Again, we planted more than that, but not all the sites made. But we had Newton, Andale, Clearwater, Belle Plaine, and Caldwell. The weather station data I'm using is from Hayesville. It's got the longest weather information, so I'm using the weather data from that. Again, I recognize our sponsors. We also have funding from Monsanto, Syngenta, Limagrain, and FMC that helps with this project. The varieties that we tested this year, there were 30 of them: AgSeco, Ag Icon, Agramax, Amen Cartwright. We had several from Kansas Wheat Alliance in Kansas. Everest, we had 2 varieties that were experimental lines from Alan Fritz. Then Larry, Silverado, Venata, Weststar, and Zenda. All the varieties with an asterisk are new to the test, so this is the first year of data we had. Limagrain had several: Atomic Chrome, Fusion, Helix, and Valiant. OGI had Double Stop, Gallagher, Greenhammer, Showdown, Smith's Gold. Polanski had Paradise and Rockstar. Syngenta AgriPro had Achieve, Bob Dole, Monument, and Wolverine. And then for the west spread varieties, 4269, 4303, 4515, and 4699. The weather this year, comparing in past years, was actually really pretty average. So you can see the black line is the long-term average, and this begins October 1st. A water year is defined as October 1st to September 30th of the following year. And so that's the perfect wheat growing period. I've just plotted this up until about July. You can see we get kind of average rain through the winter, and then really the spring rain in May really starts to increase. We get much more rain then. The red line is 2020. You can see we had a little bit above average rainfall all the way up until about May, and then it actually leveled off and we didn't get so much rain. That might not work so well with corn and soybeans, but it's perfect for wheat, because if there's any disease around, the drier harvest makes it easier to get in the field and harvest. And then 2019 was just this ridiculous amount of rain that just, well, it was record setting. 2018 was actually our lowest year as far as this current 6-year average. As far as temperature goes, it was pretty much right on average throughout the wheat growing season. Got a little bit of a cool spell, had some warm spell in the middle of, but for the most part, it was average temperatures throughout the growing season. This is the summary comparison year by year of all the different varieties that are grown at these different locations. And you can see 2017 was by far the best year that we've had. 2020 was actually a pretty good year. The average yield was right about 60 bushels an acre, a little bit better than 2018, not nearly as good as 2017. If you look at test weight, and we don't have test weight for 16 or 17, but the test weight is quite a bit better than it was the previous 2 years. If we compare the different varieties from one year to the next, we could see they follow pretty much that same pattern. Everybody did much better in 2017. In 2020, there really wasn't that much difference between the Kansas Wheat Alliance varieties, Everest, Larry, and Zenda. But in other years, some of the other ones did particularly better. OGI showed pretty much the same way, really not a whole lot of differences between any of them. 2017 was much better. Smith's Gold was a new one that showed up in 2018, so we don't have quite so much data for it. And again, with the AgriPro varieties, 2017 was much better. Not a whole lot of difference or range in yield between the different ones. It looks like last year Bob Dole did much better than the other two varieties, but that really didn't, we didn't see that again this year. West spread, again, fairly similar. Some did much better in other years than in kind of average. Overall, this is the total summary. And again, this is kind of difficult to see just because there's so many different varieties in here. This data is all available online, so you can look at the actual yields. But here are yields for all the different varieties tested, and you can see the average was 60.8. Everything above the line is particularly good. And then there's a few that are a little bit below the line, but not horribly. It's not, we didn't have a huge range in yields. The real standout, Rockstar had the highest yield at 69 bushels an acre. And then Showdown, LCS Atomic, and LCS Valiant did very well. Those are the top 4. The other two of the West spread varieties did very well. And the KWA Venata also did very well. As far as test weight, it looks like there's higher variability in test weight, but this scale on the left-hand side starts at 54 and not 0. So it looks like there's a lot of variability in test weight, and you can see there's a couple of very low test weights and some much higher test weight. Average test weight was 60.6. That's all I have. Thank you very much. If you have any questions, feel free to give me a call or contact one of the other fellows, but I'd be happy to talk to you. Thank you very much.
All right, thank you, Gretchen. And as Kelsey said earlier, if you have any questions, you can type them in the chat down there. we will have time at the end as well if something comes up to your mind that you want to ask. So I was going to give it a second here. Okay, if you have questions for Gretchen, just type those in the chat. We're going to continue on with our program. Our next speaker is our new extension wheat pathologist, Kelsey Anderson. She filled the position formerly held by Eric DeWolf. Kelsey has been with us for several months now. I believe she started in May in the middle of all of those virtual wheat tours and demo plot meetings. She was one of our presenters for our South Central Kansas wheat demo plot. So Kelsey, good to have you with us tonight. We're looking forward to hearing what you have for us.
Hey, great. So can you see my screen?
Yes.
Awesome. Well, thanks for having me. Thanks for the nice introduction. Like Jeff mentioned, my name is Kelsey Anderson Onofre. Onofre is a little hard to pronounce, so Kelsey Anderson or just Kelsey is fine. I'm an extension plant pathologist, mainly focused here on wheat and forages, and also an assistant professor in the plant pathology department. So I'm really glad to be here. I'm going to talk a little bit, I know Gretchen touched on variety selection, so I was going to just talk about some timely reminders about seed treatment choice, and then some foliar fungicide by variety information that's kind of fresh off the press from this past season. So I just wanted to, I know Gretchen touched on varieties, but I just wanted to point out that we have a brand new version of the wheat variety disease and insect rating guide available. So this goes through many, many varieties, and so we added at least 10 varieties to this document. And this really goes through data that we summarize across the state, multi-year data, where we have ratings for the major diseases that we find here in Kansas. So if you haven't checked it out, check it out. There's also a new section highlighting the Clearfield and Coaxium varieties. So if you page to the back of this document, you can see those have been pulled out, and there's a little more information about those technologies. So that's variety selection, and I think that's it's pretty clear that that's important for disease management on farm. But I also want to touch on seed treatments, especially right now as we move into planting, and also foliar fungicides. So seed treatments, they can be very effective, and two diseases that we were particularly worried about in this part of Kansas this year were common bunt, sometimes known as stinking smut. So that's a disease that sometimes it's really hard to see until harvest, and then it's sometimes distinctive because there's a very foul odor in the grain, or the grain fills with these spores and then break open at harvest and infest other seeds. So seed that's saved can be contaminated and become infected in the next season. So we had some reports of price discounts this year that snuck up on some folks. So this is one that is very easily controlled with seed treatments. And so this is just a reminder that that's out there. Also, while out scouting, we saw a lot more loose smut than in previous seasons. And usually this is just a nagging disease. If you see one head per 5,000, it's not going to cause a problem. But when it starts to get into those maybe one head per 1,000 heads or one head per 100 heads, we can start to see some yield loss from loose smut. So this is another one that there really isn't variety resistance available, but a seed treatment can be very effective when properly applied. We also want to keep a lookout for flag smut. That's another one that's popped up as an important here in Kansas in the last 5 years. And also fusarium head blight. So fusarium head blight, we had some reports, particularly in South Central Kansas, although I think that drier period during grain fill and at that late flowering stage really saved us from some losses to head blight this year, so that was good news. But there was some low levels of head blight in many fields. So if you did have some fusarium head blight in the seed lot, this would be a good choice to use a seed treatment, because that fusarium pathogen can cause some early season seedling blight or damping off. Seed treatments can also be really effective for root and foot rot. So those white heads that kind of pop up now and again, and sometimes in patches in the field, and those can really, you know, they might not be the biggest yield robber, but they can be an ankle biter. So they can take a little bit of our yield away, so it can protect against some early season infections, and also can suppress fall foliar diseases. So that even though seed treatments won't provide protection into the spring, they will lower some of that fall establishment, which can provide some benefit for later in the season. And so just wanted to show an illustration about some seed-borne diseases and how they accumulate. So especially with common bunt, we see maybe 1 or 2 infected plants in year 1. And after a second year, especially if seed is saved back, or if a seed treatment hasn't been applied, you can really see those losses accumulate. And then by a 3rd year, it can start to be kind of sneak up as a yield loss or problem where we're seeing an actual price discount, which we were hearing about this year. So I'm bringing this up to just make sure we kind of cut it off at the pass, and if this has been an issue, we can start to use some seed treatments. So we've updated our seed treatment guide here at Kansas State for wheat specifically. So this goes through some priorities for using wheat seed treatments. So which seed lots would be most benefited by a seed treatment. Also just some suggestions for seed treatment success, and kind of a little table here to help decode some of those active ingredients that are common in seed treatments. So most of the seed treatments that are out there and available really have more than one active ingredient. Typically, sometimes there's just one, but usually they'll have a blend of fungicides, maybe an insecticide, imidacloprid, that can help kind of keep down fall aphid populations, and some have plant growth regulators that can help that early season establishment. And it's important to pay attention to the fungicides that are in the seed treatment, because if it's a fungicide like Sedaxane, that's really good for Rhizoctonia, for example, or a metalaxyl and mefenoxam, that would help with Pythium. And then these tebuconazoles, triticonazole, prothioconazole, those are really going to help with our bunts and our smuts. And so it's really important to have at least one of those actives in our seed treatment. Just as a reminder, I know everyone on the call is familiar with this, but seed treatments don't really provide more than 30 days of protection. So they're going to help with that stand establishment, they're going to protect that single plant, and then that residual life will wear off. So we have a table here of some of the more common current seed treatments that have been updated this year with some of the, for example, products have just been upgraded a little bit, and an active ingredient might have been added. And so we have here which diseases each of these is labeled for. For example, all of the products here are labeled for common bunt and also for loose smut. And we also have some variation in which diseases, which root rots are suppressed or controlled by these particular products. So like I said before, it's just important to watch out to make sure we have one of these triazole fungicides like difenoconazole here in Cruiser Max or tebuconazole. And a reminder that those seed treatments typically have a grazing restriction. Some do, some don't, so that's just an important thing to watch out. So it's important to select a product that has the active ingredient that matches the pests that we're trying to control. And to make sure our seed treatment's really successful, we want to start with well-cleaned seed, because when seed has some chaff, for example, or dust, that really will keep that product from adhering and will reduce efficacy. So it really only works if every seed is properly treated. If we don't mix if the commercial treater or the on-farm treater doesn't have the correct mixture, so if that seed treatment chemistry is lumpy or too watery, then we can have reduced coverage of seeds, and we really want to make sure that we have uniform coverage. So here were some pictures taken by Bill Bacchus and Eric DeWolf that just illustrate what a good, well-covered seed lot looks like. So here you can see every seed is completely treated and pretty well covered, and that's in comparison to very poor coverage. So here, maybe only 20% of the seeds have adequate coverage. So in a lot that's treated like this, you're going to have a fair amount of disease get through, right? Because only that single plant is essentially protected by the seed treatment. So we touched on seed treatments just as a reminder as we're moving into planting. And then I want to move into foliar fungicides. So this is I think something that is an important reminder. This is some data that was generated over 5 years of data collected by Eric DeWolf, where he showed that basically it really matters how much disease pressure we have on farm and what the susceptibility of our variety is. So for example, here in a very high pressure disease situation, which I think this year we were more in this moderate category, especially for stripe rust in this part of Kansas. But if we're in a high or even moderate disease pressure situation, we're going to see the highest payoff of that fungicide application. And the more susceptible the variety to the diseases that are present, the higher that payoff is going to be. And so here, Romulo shared some data and his team conducted some trials where they looked at this past season 14 varieties and 4 different fungicide treatments. And they used the fungicide Top Guard, and they made either a single application at jointing of Top Guard, the version with just flutriafol, 5 ounces at jointing. They compared that to an application done at heading, so Feeks 10, early heading, and then a jointing plus heading fungicide. And they conducted this trial at 5 locations, so Ashland Bottoms, Conway Springs, and they had Hutchinson, a full season field, and then a Hutchinson field after beans and a Belleville field after beans. And they had disease pressure at all locations. There was early season Septoria in 4 of the locations, so this Septoria complex that sometimes builds up in that residue. And then they also had leaf rust and stripe rust in these plots this year. And the yields ranged from 42 to 82 bushels per acre with a mean of 58 bushels per acre across all of the locations. And so the team did something pretty interesting this year. They took green cover estimates. So here, this really helps illustrate the value of getting a variety with a good foliar disease resistance package. Because here you can see LCS Chrome, that's one of our varieties that has pretty solid resistance for leaf rust, stripe rust, and that Septoria disease complex. And you can really see that even without a fungicide in these high pressure disease situations, there was pretty effective control just by the resistance itself. So here we had green leaves and green foliage, and that was comparable to the coverage of a dual fungicide application, so a 2 fungicide application in high pressure. So that variety resistance really held its own. And then we can compare that to Everest, which has a weaker disease package, good for some things like Fusarium head blight, but weaker on stripe rust and Septoria. And here you can see a lot more loss of green cover when compared to that dual fungicide application. Here you can see that fungicide really made up for that absence of resistance for the foliar diseases here. So what about yield? So grain yield here across the treatments, we really saw an increase with each of the treatment applications. So for example, with only an application at jointing, there was a small yield increase across all of the treatments, across all of the locations, I mean. We saw a bit more of an increase at heading. So that heading application might be the sweet spot, at least if we're not making an application for something else, so if we're trying to manage that application cost. And then we got the highest yield response from that jointing plus heading treatment. So that was in that economical range. And so that's an interesting finding, so that those 2 kind of lower rate applications had the highest payoff, but maybe not statistically different than that single heading application. And these were pretty high disease pressure fields, so that's an important finding. So that fungicide response, is important to note that that was across all of the locations, and that fungicide response was variable between the location and variety. So here I'll just show, this is Everest, so our more susceptible foliar variety in ashland bottoms, and this is LCS chrome, and these were both locations that had disease, and so again, we saw that higher yield increase in our variety that was more susceptible. And we saw a little bit less, although we still had some benefit from that heading fungicide application and that joint plus heading fungicide application at ashland bottoms. But in a location like Hutchinson that was late planted after beans, those differences weren't as clear. So it's important the location and also the disease pressure. And I think this highlights the value of scouting too, to make sure we're really getting the payoff from that application. So the really cool thing about this trial, and Romulo is going to talk about another trial that was designed similarly, was that they looked at 14 varieties and their responses to these fungicides. So this can really help make those precision recommendations for the variety that a producer has on farm. And so if you look across here, and sorry, this is kind of a lot to take in, but if you look here, this is averages across 5 locations. Here, Bob Dole, for example, this is the average yield response with no fungicide. And so this is this value here is the average of the resistance to those 3 pathogens: Septoria, leaf spot, leaf rust, and stripe rust. And so you can see a more resistant variety like Bob Dole had less of a fungicide payoff than some of these than some of the other varieties that had a little more susceptibility. Everest, again, our more susceptible variety, that's where the payoff of fungicide applications, even the early application at FEEC 6 was starting to pay off across locations. A variety like Larry, that's also very susceptible, had a high payoff. LCS Chrome, a more resistant variety, it was a lower or pretty much under the average. And then if we looked at something like Grainfield, which is probably the most susceptible variety in the test, we saw that a really high payoff or yield benefit from all of the applications. So that's, again, to just highlight some of the value of, if you have a variety and you're planning to plant a susceptible variety, that some of these applications, even these early applications, can help pay off through that grain fill period. One thing that Romulo pointed out that I think is really interesting too is that these early, typically, sometimes we think of early Septoria as not yield limiting, but here, especially in the Hutchinson full season site, there was a significant payoff or a yield decline from that Septoria rating. So that Septoria rating was associated with some yield loss, which is pretty interesting. So, you know, it's not good to just ignore that early Septoria infection that could be dragging our yield down, and maybe an early application could help bring that back up. And then, of course, those late season diseases, Septoria, leaf rust, and stripe rust, are going to pull that yield down a significant amount. And that varied again by location. So I wanted to, you know, we're talking about fungicides, and that it's really important to mention that that's a single product. It's a newer product, but one that's promoted to have a high residual life, so a longer residual activity. And we do have an updated document about our foliar fungicide efficacy, so keep that kind of tagged for when that time comes to make a fungicide decision next year. And this has, again, updated product and label information. These labels change all the time, so we're trying to keep that as up to date as possible. So I hope I didn't take too much time, but please feel free to reach out to me anytime, especially if you have disease issues. But even if the wheat's all looking healthy, I'd love to know. Here's my contact information, and I think I'll ask if there are any questions.
Thanks, Kelsey. That's definitely something important to keep in mind is your varieties, disease resistance and susceptibility. When you're selecting a variety, just a note on our results, the Andel plot and the Caldwell plot did not receive fungicide treatments. And then in that Andel plot, there was a heavy infestation of Septoria and tan spot that we lost a lot of leaf area from. And I believe in Caldwell, they experienced low to moderate stripe rust. I'll have to get the information from Randy and include that in our results.
Yeah, that's a great point. I have a question here in the chat. Someone asked if you have leftover treated seed from the previous year, do you need to retreat it? And that's a good question. If you ask the companies, they might say yes, but I would say 1 year out, I think you're still going to have enough activity to pay off there. So I hope that if you have any more questions, feel free to ask, but that would be my recommendation. Especially, yeah, because you're probably gonna want to use that seed, especially if you can't get it. You don't really have another use for it. I will call out, maybe Romulo can comment more on this because he's more familiar, that you can have the germination tested on some of that, I believe. Maybe Romulo, you could make a comment. So if you're worried about there being some loss of germination after a year, then you can have that tested, I think, by the okay, Romulo, help me out here.
Hi, Kelsey. Yeah, no, definitely. You can send it out to the Kansas Crop Improvement Association here in Manhattan, and they will test for germination. So that's usually a good practice because they are also going to give you the seed size, right? How many seeds per pound you have, and so you can actually go out and put an actual seeding rate based on seeds per acre rather than pounds per acre. So a bunch of benefits there. I'll definitely send a sample to the Kansas Crop Improvement Association, but I agree with you. I think when we're out, we should still be in good shape.
Okay, we don't have any more questions. We're going to go ahead and move on. Our last speaker for the night is a guy many of you are familiar with. Romulo Lolato is our extension wheat specialist. He is the guy to go to for all of your wheat production questions. So Romulo, are you ready?
I am. I'll just ask Kelsey to stop sharing her screen, and then, yep, there we go. So let me go ahead and, good evening, folks. Before I share here, it's good to be here with you guys. Usually we do this in person, and that's a lot more fun, especially because we usually have some pretty good meal. But in the absence of that opportunity, it's good to be here and touching bases on some of the research that we have going on. A lot of it actually coming from down there in South Central Kansas. So, Jeff, can you see my screen there?
Yes, I can.
Okay, excellent. Okay, folks, so as you guys know, I usually like to do an overview of some research that we have going on around the state, right, on specifically with variety and its interaction with management practices, right? And so what we're going to talk about today here is more specifically looking, the majority of the time we're going to spend on nitrogen, and with the question, are different varieties responding differently to nitrogen fertilization? We're also going to touch bases on sulfur fertility because it's more and more an important issue, and especially there in Sumner County and in that South Central region, we see more and more sulfur deficiency. And then finally, some update on research on seed treatment and seed cleaning that we also have going on. So moving forward here, the first trial that we're going to talk about, it's the exact same one that Kelsey just talked to us on the fungicide trial, right? So we did the exact same protocol, but now looking at different nitrogen rates. So those same 14 varieties that are listed here in this slide, and we gave them 4 different nitrogen rates, either 0, 40, 80, or 120 units of N per acre. This nitrogen was applied as urea early in the spring. And we also applied here 20 units of sulfur, just so sulfur was not limiting, right? We're just looking at nitrogen deficiency here and not sulfur. For locations, you see there that the closest there in South Central Kansas would be Conway Springs, actually a little bit south of Conway Springs, and Hutchinson as well. And then what's interesting is take a look at those final values of initial soil nitrate content. You see that it goes from about 24 units of N per acre all the way to 170 units of nitrogen per acre. And so that gives you an idea of the range in initial conditions that we had in these 4 locations, and also of the type of response that we were having to the nitrogen in these 4 locations. So let's look at a few of the locations that were more, well, before that, let's take a look at the range in grain yield that we have. And you see here in these 4 locations, the yields went from about 20 all the way to 90 bushels per acre, averaging 50, right? So across these 4 locations last year. Now, how did the plots look like? This photo that you see here is showing the variety WB4269 in Conway Springs there, either at 0 or at 120 units of nitrogen per acre. So a lot of differences there in the growth of the variety, the biomass, canopy development, greenness of that leaf, just an overall much better early development, right? This is during the stem elongation in April. If we compare to Bob Dole that you see here, the very same symptoms, right? We have a 0N or 120N there on the left and the right hand side. Again, Bob Dole had a little bit wider leaves, and that's very clearly from the photo, but the symptoms are about the same, right? A very light green, yellow type of color, kind of more of a pale type of yellow. They're really indicating that nitrogen deficiency. Closer to maturity, and now we're looking at a different site here, Nashland Bottoms, but it's another site that was very nitrogen deficient. You can see that the difference in the symptoms that we see now at maturity are still much less biomass, right? On the left-hand side, you can roll the crop very easily. So much less biomass, a much shorter crop as well, although it might not show as clearly from the photo. And more importantly here, our yield component heads per square foot, right? Which is the most important yield component that we have. Much fewer heads per square foot. We look at Bob Dole, we have the exact same type of symptoms here. Keeping in mind that this trial, everything got foliar fungicide. So the disease that Kelsey was talking about up to now is not really a confounding factor, at least in this trial here. Just nitrogen, that's what we're looking at. So why have I been focusing so much in Bob Dole and 4269? Well, the reason is because these 2 varieties, they behave quite differently, especially as we went to higher yielding conditions. Let me go over what we're looking at here so everybody is on the same page. What we're looking at here is all the data set that we collected last year for these 2 varieties, Bob Dole in red, 4269 in yellow. On the very left-hand side there, we have the lowest nitrogen rate in the lowest yield environment, right? So it's a very low environment with a very low nitrogen rate. We go to the other extreme, right-hand side, now we have the highest nitrogen rate in the highest yielding environment, right? So that's what we're looking at. As we go down, we're looking at the mean of all the varieties. That's why it's the same value for both Bob Dole and 4269. Now, when you look at the left-hand side, there's a very clear division where the mean of 4269 is at about 84 bushels per acre compared to the mean of Bob Dole in this case, which was about 54 bushels per acre. So a very different behavior of these varieties when the nitrogen was the limitation, right? It's important to make that clear because in the trial that Kelsey just showed, which was fungicide, the story was different, right? Bob Dole was actually much more competitive there when without fungicide, rather than here when we're actually limiting it from the nitrogen perspective. So why am I talking that they're so different like this? Well, you see here is very clearly that 4269 was yielding more, actually 26% more than the average, especially as we increased in our yield environment, as we provided more nitrogen. In the meantime, Bob Dole was producing about 20% less than the average, especially in this very high yield environment. Now, what can be happening here? We're putting a lot of nitrogen out there, right? Maybe we're seeing more lodging. Bob Dole is a very tall variety, perhaps it can't handle as well. Another thing that can be going on as well, Bob Dole usually has a much better quality, and so we might be putting more nitrogen into building protein rather than yield, and so therefore not performing as well when the limitation is nitrogen. Okay, but that's why we're focusing so much on these two varieties, right? Now, looking across the entire data and how yield was affected by nitrogen, what you're looking at in the bottom there is the total nitrogen available in the season. So this includes the amount of nitrogen in the profile when we planted, plus an estimate of how much the organic matter is providing and what we apply. And on the left-hand side, we have grain yield. So essentially, when you look across those four environments that we have two very clear divisions, a set of high-yielding environments where there was a response to nitrogen and then plateau, and a set of low-yielding environments where there was also response to nitrogen and then plateau. So the next question is, when you look at these high and low-yielding conditions, are the varieties responding differently? Are they maximizing yields at different yield levels? And does that depend on the same amount of nitrogen being available? Right, and that's what we're looking at here. So let's take a closer look at the low-yielding environment. Again, Bob Doe in red, 4269 in yellow, sorry. And the important things that we're talking about here is the breakpoint. So how much nitrogen was needed until that variety leveled out, right? So in the bottom, again, nitrogen available. In the left-hand side, grain yield. So how much nitrogen was necessary until the variety was not increasing yield anymore. And at what yield level did it plateau? In this case, 47 bushels per acre. If we look at 4269, it needed just a notch more of nitrogen there, 109 units of N, but it yielded about 5 bushels per acre more. If we look at the high yield environment, now we have a much more clear division of these breakpoints here, where Bob Doe needed about 200 units of nitrogen per acre, maximizing yields at about 64. 4269 was needing, the model is telling here 232 units of N per acre to maximize at 84. But really, if you take a look at those 2 points that is highlighted in purple there, they're very similar. I mean, they're about the same, right? So the question that we have here is, the grain yield is quite different. Yield plateau is very different, right? But are they actually maximizing a different nitrogen rates or the same level of nitrogen available? And this is an overall for the high yield environment for all the varieties that we evaluated where they plateaued. You see that it ranged from 54 to 84, and how much nitrogen was needed, ranging from 200 to 250. And then for the low yielding environment here, again, the range from 42 to 52, and nitrogen needed between 100 and 130. Okay, so there is a considerable amount of variation, especially in yield and somewhat in the nitrogen needed to reach there as well. So the question now is, are they related? Or in other words, varieties that are yielding more or reaching higher yield plateau are the same that are needing more nitrogen. And that's what we are looking at here. Each one of these points is a different variety. In the bottom, we have how much nitrogen was needed for the breakpoint. In the left-hand side, where the plateau was. And in blue, high yield. In yellow, low yield. And essentially, they were not. In other words, there were variability in nitrogen needed to reach there. There were variability in yield, but they were not related, meaning that some varieties were reaching the same, a much higher yield level, okay, with the same amount of nitrogen. Now the question is that because these varieties have a higher nitrogen use efficiency, or perhaps they are not putting as much protein, so there may be a protein penalty, right? Now we still don't have the protein data to look at this, but we can calculate nitrogen use efficiency. We're going to look at the protein later on. So first, when we look at nitrogen use efficiency, the main thing that was explaining it is the amount of nitrogen that was available. The more nitrogen we had available to the crop, the less efficient it was in converting nitrogen into grain yield. Yielded more, but it was not as efficient. Now, when we look at varieties, there was also a significant difference in varieties' nitrogen use efficiency, right? So you see here, the varieties in blue, which were grain field and 4269, they had a higher nitrogen use efficiency than the varieties in yellow. And then the green ones, they are in the same boat. They are equal to the high and equal to the low as well. So the difference there is between the yellow ones, 458, Everest and Green Hammer, and the blue had lower nitrogen efficiency, and the blue ones that had a higher nitrogen use efficiency there. So there's some indication there that we have the genetic variability for nitrogen use efficiency in the varieties that we're testing here. The other question that we had is if we just look at those environments where nitrogen was limited, right? And by that I mean any increase in nitrogen amount was actually increasing grain yields as well. If we just look at those nitrogen limited environments, are the varieties that are more efficient in converting nitrogen into grain yield in those situations also having a higher yield level, a higher yield plateau, right? And the answer was yes. That's the same graph that we looked at before, but now the answer is yes, meaning that varieties that use nitrogen more efficiently in the nitrogen limited situation, they're also able to reach a higher yield plateau when nitrogen was not limiting anymore. So that wraps up some of the nitrogen data that we collected this last season. We're still processing protein and really looking forward to taking a look at that data. But you guys know nitrogen doesn't tell the whole story, right? We need to look at sulfur as well, especially because of what you see in this graph, which is a long-term look at sulfur deposition from the atmosphere in Kansas and how much is being harvested in the wheat state level, right? And so essentially since about 2000s, we've been mining our sulfur from the soil, meaning that more and more what you see in this photo here, it's a reality, right? We have sulfur deficiency very often, especially in South Central Kansas. The way that we differentiate these from nitrogen deficiency is that nitrogen is going to be a more pale yellow and sulfur is going to be a more bright type of yellow. And the sulfur is going to be on the upper leaf. They are going to be the ones turning yellow, and nitrogen is going to be on the lower leaf. So the older ones are going to turn yellow first. So those are two important differences there. But we're also interested in looking at that interaction between nitrogen and sulfur, fertility-wise. So we've been on a third year of a project funded by the Kansas Wheat Commission, where we're looking at 3 different nitrogen rates, 4 different sulfur rates, and using different varieties and across different years as well. So very briefly, if we just take a look at the type of symptom that it has in the field, a little bit closer here, you can see these 2 photos, 0 sulfur on the left-hand side, 20 units of sulfur in the right-hand side. Huge difference in biomass production there, right? To some extent reminding what we saw in the nitrogen trial before. But keep in mind that here they have the exact same nitrogen rate. It's just the presence of or absence of 20 units of sulfur in a soil where it's a little bit sandier soil with lower organic matter, right? That's important because it's not in every soil that we see the response. We tend to see more response in low organic matter sandier soil. As we get closer to maturity, again, a very similar symptoms to what we were seeing in that nitrogen trial. But this gives you an idea of, even though it's only 20 pounds of sulfur per acre, it gives you an idea of how much difference it can make from a yield component perspective, right? If you take a look at this maturity photo, the difference in mass that we have, the difference in height, the difference in number of heads per square foot that we have there. So again, very easy fix there, right? Just during the spring to go out and apply 10 or 20 units of sulfur to the crop. Of course, depending on the soil that you have. Okay, let's go into the grain yields and very briefly review what we found so far. And I'm going to show you data from the 2019 season. Now in 2020, we also had this trial, and we had a trial in Sumner County as well. The responses were pretty clear too, but we're still processing that data. So what are we looking at here? In the bottom, our nitrogen rate, either 50%, 100%, or 150% of our yield goal, which was 60 bushels per acre. The left-hand side, we have the grain yield. And then the black line, which is right there at the bottom, right? The black line, it shows us 0 sulfur. So again, in a sandy soil where sulfur is deficient, putting 0 sulfur, regardless of our nitrogen rate, our yields were at that 40 bushel per acre range, right? So there was no response to nitrogen, and we could put 150%, or we could put 90 units of nitrogen there, or even more, and we really saw no response compared to 45, right, or 50. Now, look at the red line, and the red line is when we added 10 pounds of sulfur per acre. So you see that first thing, we see a huge bump in yields. We went from 40 to 60 at the low nitrogen level, right? And then as we provided more nitrogen, we increased yields from 60 to close to 80, right? So now we're allowing the crop to respond to the added nitrogen as well. We're not only bringing the yields up, but we're allowing the crop to be more efficient in using the nitrogen. However, when we really pushed our nitrogen all the way to the 150 there was no response, right? The red line is flat. So that flat red line tells us that maybe on that very high end, only 10 units of sulfur was still deficient. They were still limiting yield. Because if you look at the green or the blue lines where we had 20 or 40 units of sulfur, it was linear. It continued to increase as we gave more nitrogen, right? So again, this is showing us that about 20 units of sulfur per acre was enough to maximize yields, even at a very high nitrogen fertility level here. So keeping in mind there, in sandier soils, low organic matter, we're seeing a considerable amount of response to sulfur. And this last season, we got growers, especially from Sedgwick County, showing quite a bit of sulfur response in their commercial fields as well. Folks, switching gear to our last topic here, Kelsey talked about seed cleaning and seed treatment.
I had a question just before you move on to seed cleaning. What form of sulfur was used in the trial, and when was it applied?
Great question. So this was all liquid, right? So we were using thiosol as the form of sulfur, and it was applied at spring greenup. So, the management of sulfur is very similar to the management of nitrogen, because the crop uptakes sulfur about the same time that it does nitrogen, right? So it takes up a little bit during the fall, not much. And then the bulk of it is going to be between spring greenup and heading. By the time it goes through flowering there, probably 80% or more of the sulfur has already been taken up. In a dry season, it might be close to 100%. If the season is long and a nice grain filling conditions, it might continue to take up through grain fill. But anyways, by flowering, about 80% or so has been taken up. And so spring greenup is usually the time to go. That also reduces the chances of losses, right? Because if we put it out in the fall and we have a very wet winter, sulfur is mobile in the profile, and so we might leak out. We might lose some of that sulfur. So very good question. This was liquid ammonium thiosol. We haven't seen difference from ammonium sulfate either. We've done some trials with ammonium sulfate on the dry end, and the response was about the same. So,
thank you.
Yeah, no problem. Feel free to send out the questions anytime there. So just to wrap up here, so Kelsey talked about the importance of seed treatment, right? Especially when we have some seed-borne diseases. And so in order for us to figure out what's the value on the long run, right, of seed cleaning and seed treatment, and in this case, we were also interested in seeding rate. We went out and in the last two growing seasons ago, in 2018-19, we started a trial that we've ran for 2 years now in 7 locations in the first year, 10 locations in the second year, but I'm only showing data from 15 here. So 15 locations between these last 2 years. What we're looking at here, variety SY monument, we're looking at 3 seeding rates, either 600K, 900,000, or 1.2 million seeds per acre. 3 seed cleaning methods, either a control, which is like no cleaning at all, just out of the combine, that's we get there and we plant. Air screen, or through gravity table, right, for improving our cleaning method. And then 2 seed treatments, either a control with no seed treatment, or a combination of Cruiser Max and Cruiser 5FF, so insecticide and fungicide seed treatment there. Funded by the Kansas Crop Improvement Association for this study. So across these 15 locations, what was the value of plant population that we have had? And you can see here that we had an increase in grain yield as we increased plant population from 600,000 yielding 63.5 bushels per acre, 5 bushels more when we went to 900,000, and another 3 4 bushels as we went to 1.2 million seeds per acre. So definitely showing us that 1.2 is probably where we'd like to be. And next we asked ourselves, what was the difference what was the yield difference between the 1.2 million seeds per acre and the 600,000 across all of these comparisons that we've had. And you see here that the average, right? So in the bottom there, you have the bushels per acre, and then the left-hand side, how many times it occurred. Black line just show the 0. So in red there, you have the average of 8 bushels per acre. The majority of the values are between 0 and 10, more or less, 0 and 15 bushels per acre. So a very consistent benefit of going with 1.2 million seeds per acre. Okay, let's look at seed cleaning now. And keep in mind that we're starting with seed from seed production fields. Okay, these are not commercial grain fields; these are seed production fields. So it's already well managed field. But we had about a 2 bushel per acre increase in grain yield as we went from no cleaning to air screen to the top of the gravity table, right? So about 3.8 to 4 bushels per acre grain overall from the seed cleaning process there. And then how often was this beneficial? You see here that, again, on average, was at 3.2 bushels per acre yield gain from cleaning the seed. And the majority of the times that we did this comparison was between 0 and probably 5 bushels per acre yield gain there. So if we consider the cost of seed cleaning of $1 per bushel, right, and it's really a no-brainer. You're gaining 3 bushels per acre on $4 bushel crop is $12 per acre. If you subtract $1 from cleaning, that's essentially net profit right there. And then from the seed treatment, it was a single bushel per acre on average. It was significant, right? It was still significant because we have a lot of locations here, so this was still significant, but it was increasing about a bushel per acre from that seed treatment. The range you see there sometimes a little bit on the negative side, sometimes was as high as 11 bushels per acre on the positive, but on average, that's very close to 1 bushel per acre. And then whenever we did the profitability analysis, if we consider a $4 per bushel seed treatment cost, this is breaking even in about half of the time, right? So you think that you're going to break even in at least 50% of the time, and or more, right? You're either breaking even or more, but you have all the other benefits that Kelsey was mentioning before as well, right? From protecting against some of those seed-borne diseases and sometimes against insects as well, viral transmitted diseases by those insects. So anyways, this, folks, is a summary of what we've done so far in this last 15 site years for seed cleaning and seed treatment there. So again, very quick summary here. The optimum nitrogen rate was similar across all varieties. It was not associated with varieties that were yielding more. So there are varieties with higher nitrogen use efficiency. The question is, are they lacking protein? And we're still going to answer that. Sulfur, improving grain yields, especially in those cases where we're working with sandier soils, lower organic matter. It's not going to be in every scenario, but in those scenarios, we have more chances of getting a very good response to sulfur, including South Central Kansas, several trials that we did there. And then 1.2 million seeds per acre was usually the highest yielding seeding rate that we had. Gravity table giving us about 3.5 bushels per acre gain from cleaning the seed, and an additional about 1 bushel per acre gain from treating that seed. So that wraps up for me. I'll be happy to take any questions either about what the things that we presented here or other things that were discussed as well, varieties and things along these lines. So.
All right, thank you, Romulo. As he said, go ahead and type your question in the chat down there. I had a question for you, Romulo. Last year, you put together some information from surveys that you collected from farmers, stuff as far as, I think, fungicide use and planting date, stuff like that. Where can we access that information at? Or is it available?
Yeah, that's a So we finished that survey last year. The student who is responsible for that survey sent me actually a couple of days ago his final his final analysis of everything that we discussed, and so it's on the process of being published, right? So that survey, it's good that you're bringing it up there, Jeff, because we got data from 700 commercial fields of wheat all over the state, right? It's a very nice data, so it's actually producer data. And then we're looking at things like nitrogen rate, or Kelsey showed fungicide, right? We can actually now get that data and look on actual producer fields. How does it compare to the research that we're doing in small plots, right? And very briefly looking at the fungicide side of things, it seems to be holding up quite well, right? In commercial fields that we were looking at the survey, fungicide was very often adopted in higher yielding fields, and many times it was bringing up to 10 or even more bushels per acre difference between fields with fungicide and without. So, yeah, we really appreciate the producers who worked with us on that, and we are wrapping up that report, so it's available hopefully still within, probably not for the growing season, but within this year, we should make it available.
All right. Yeah, I thought that was a really good survey. Excited to see that report. Okay, I got a question that came into my chat. So what was the main difference in the higher yield results comparing the Conway Springs plot versus the Clearwater plot? Fertility level in soil, question mark, since the plots are only a couple miles away. So they're saying was it the fertility level in the soil that was the difference between that Conway and Clearwater plot?
So the Clearwater plot, it averaged. So the Clearwater plot is the demonstration plot, right? I think
okay, yeah, that's mostly what that was about. That could be for me.
And then the Conway one is the one that I showed, right? So they're different. Keep in mind that the high yield that I was showing, the very high yields that we got were in Hutchinson. That was the highest yield that was on that 80 bushel per acre range, 60 to 80, right? And I'm looking at the Caldwell plots here. I think you're averaging what, about 55 or 60 more or less, Jeff?
And that was Conway and Clearwater that he was asking about. And I haven't even looked at the Conway data very close. So Conway and Clearwater.
So the Conway, the variety trial results from Conway Springs, they're usually in a very high yield spot. Usually they are in the with Tom Poly there, and Tom Poly, I mean, fertility is quite high. He always puts out sulfur and nitrogen and fungicide usually as well. So that could justify some. I don't remember on top of my head what was the difference between Clearwater and Conway as far as the raw yield goes.
And I know that in our plots, maybe it was whenever we initially calculated, we had used 4.5 feet for our plot width, and we decided that we'd move that down to 6 feet to include our gaps between each pass. So I think that our data from our results maybe look a little lower than what the surrounding fields were showing, just because we had a 4.5 foot drill and we're using 6 foot as our plot width to, figure for that gap. I don't think that 18 inches we added, the effect on the outer rows would be as much as having those 2 rows in there if we would have a, straight through no gap trial, if that made sense. I was kind of just going off the top of my head. Hopefully that was understandable.
Yeah, so I was opening it up here. It seems like the trial in Conway Springs, the variety trial, averaged
72 bushels per acre, whereas the one in Clearwater, it averaged less than 55, if I remember right.
Clearwater was average of 58.8 across all cultivars this year,
okay, so
2020.
Yeah, so I'm not sure
what was the management in
Clearwater. I know that the one in Conway Springs was pretty heavy
on the fertility side, and they applied for fungicide at heading. Do you know, Jeff, if Clearwater had fungicide applied?
Yes.
Yeah, you did.
Yeah. It's
Mhm.
propiconazole.
Yep.
Tilt. So here's
And
Jeff made a good point there on the calculation for the yields, right? We usually calculate considering that border in between, because otherwise it's not fair, right? Because that plot has a lot more area outside. That's why we kind of calculate using that, considering that plot, that in between the plots. So, but
the
the
data from the variety trial, we should all consider that.
Hmm. Okay, I'm not seeing any more questions coming in. I don't know if you guys are getting anything. I was going to mention one more thing. We'll see if any questions come up in the chat. I did cut up our South Central Kansas wheat demo plot, that recording we did back in May. I made that into an interactive wheat plot where you can look at each variety's video at one time. So if you go to Sedgwick County Extension website, scroll down to agriculture, click on this link here or down here, an interactive wheat plot. I don't know if you guys can see this, can you?
yes.
Okay, but I have this interactive wheat plot. You can click on a variety. I have incorporated the 2020 results and 2019 if they had them. Give some information on those if we had it from a K-State source. You can click over on the video, and that is the particular varieties video from our demo, virtual demo earlier this year. So that's another resource you can use when comparing varieties. If we didn't have information on that K-State varieties publication, then the link will take you to the company's website. So just something I wanted to mention, a tool that you can use to help compare varieties.